Buddy, thank you so much for joining me again. I am here with a human. She's not a celebrity. No, we were just talking about how it's really interesting how, but Emily Hanford. Anyhow, I'm going to get that out there because I'm not going to completely geek out. So thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I know
Yeah. Good
everybody.
evening, morning,
So
whatever it is,
excited.
wherever you're watching.
I know. I know. Everybody's going to be so excited to see you and hear what you have to say. But I wanted to start off by saying thank you so much for the work that you've done. It was how I stumbled upon you as somebody had asked me a question about how I taught sight words, high frequency words, and that sent me down this rabbit hole that eventually led me to your podcast. And then from there, I just all of a sudden had, epiphany after epiphany and really changed a lot of the way I thought about how people learn to read. So the question I would have for you is what, as an investigative journalist, what made you go down this path of learning how kids learn to read?
Such a great question. And it depends on where the story begins. I think I can tell a version of that story that starts with me being a little kid. I can start it at a lot of different places in time. But I think the most succinct way to say it is I've been a reporter for a long time. I've been covering education full time since 2008. And I started to get interested in this how people learn to read thing about 6 years ago. And it started with dyslexia, which is something that I didn't know anything about. And again, my interest in dyslexia came from somewhere, but I'll just start with the interest in dyslexia and meeting parents all over the country who had kind of the same story about they did everything quote unquote right. They read lots of books to their kids and
Yeah,
there was lots of books in the home and the parents had lots of education and the kids went to school seemingly with great sort of language skills and then couldn't read.
right.
And the parents would get engaged in a very long, what turned into really kind of a battle in many cases with the schools of trying to be like, something's wrong here. And the school sort of telling them everything's going to be fine, or maybe saying, yes, there's a problem, but then they kind of didn't think the school really had a handle on what the problem was or the proper kind of help. So what I realized there is the little epiphanies that you were talking about. Like I started to have those epiphanies too. I started just asking some questions like, how do people learn to read? What is dyslexia? Why do people with dyslexia have a hard time learning to read? So how does everyone learn to read? How did I learn to read? How did my kids learn to read? Oh, wow. Look, there's a huge amount of research on this. Like cognitive scientists and psychologists and all these people have been doing this really interesting research for 50 years. And what I started to realize is a lot of educators didn't know about it or didn't know very much about it
Right,
or didn't really understand the implications of it.
right. Like understood like this much of it, not this much of it. Yeah,
Exactly. And sometimes
right,
the this much was sort of what balanced literacy writ large sort of espoused, which is some phonics instruction. Most teachers were doing some letters and sounds a little bit, and then a lot of guided reading and sharing and all the kinds of activities and ways of using time in a typical balanced literacy classroom. And I think the missing piece for teachers and the missing piece for me, because I didn't know this, was sort of why phonics instruction is important. And it's not the only thing that's important. In fact, it's actually one small piece,
mm-hmm.
but it's this really, really important piece. Like you actually can't really be a good reader without a good understanding um, of how the sounds in the words that it has say
Right,
are represented by letters and combinations of letters, right? And so we all have to learn that. Some of us really need to be taught it very explicitly. Some of us don't need a lot of instruction. I think I was one of those kids.
right,
Um, but anyway, I started going down the rabbit hole that you went down, that so many people did, of starting to read all of this really pretty accessible information.
yeah,
I think when we first started talking about all this scientific research on reading, we had another moment like this about 20 to 25 years ago in this country,
right,
which I talk about in the Soul to Story podcast. And I really do think a lot of people had sort of a surface level understanding of what that research was. And now a lot of people are looking up and being like, wait, there's more. And now I think what's different this time is there's more that makes it more accessible. There are a lot of books, articles,
yes,
podcasts, other things,
right,
blogs written by teachers for teachers, synthesis of this stuff that's available free online that's good, that you still have to know something about to make sure you're getting good information. But there's a lot of really good information out there that I think this is making it accessible to teachers and to parents.
Right.
And so I think really one of the big reasons we are here at this moment talking about the so-called science of reading really has to do primarily with parents
Right.
and the advocacy they've been doing. Sometimes they feel like they were screaming into the wind. Many of those parents are also teachers
Right.
who had their own aha moments when they'd been teaching first grade for 10 years and then their daughter goes to school and they can't teach her how to read.
Right.
Um, so yeah, so that's kind of a little bit of the beginning of the story, I guess, of how I got into this. And then I just haven't been able to let it go because I think it's a really complex, really fascinating, interesting story. And there's
Right.
a lot to it. And there's a lot more to report on still.
Yeah. So I guess that, I will, I don't know that I shared with you before when I met you, but my sister has dyslexia.
Mm,
And so she had always felt that her issue was intelligence, right?
a lot of
And
people do.
and yet my sister's brilliant in so many different ways.
Mm.
But even as an adult, that stigma sticks with them,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Sticks with
Yeah.
them forever. And now by hearing your podcast, there's been some changes in the way that people see themselves as well. Not just I could see my sister's brilliance in so many different ways, but I shared that with her as well. So that was really helpful
Yeah.
for her and for my parents who also have shades of, I think I think we all have like shades of
Uh,
dyslexia, right? It's that
Well,
spectrum.
there's one prominent cognitive scientist who sort of described it like this: we're basically all born dyslexic, meaning we all, and some people take issue with that, but his
Right,
idea behind that is none of us are born with brains that are sort of ready and wired to read.
right,
Some of us can learn to read pretty easily, and many of us can get very, very good at reading, even though we weren't really born with brains that were designed to do it. But I think that idea of we're all born with dyslexia it is a big continuum, right? And there are some people who just need a lot of instruction and repetition to really get this reading thing right. Some people need very little. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, you
yeah,
know? Most kids are somewhere in the middle. And
right,
I think one of the big, profound sort of insights from all of this scientific research on reading is that what kids with dyslexia desperately need in terms of good explicit instruction really can be beneficial for all kids.
right,
And most kids need more explicit instruction than they were getting in a typical American school that was doing so-called balanced literacy.
right, right,
And balanced literacy, of course, sounds great because at the end of the day, balance is precisely what the goal is. There's a balance of a lot of different things that you need to be paying attention to.
hmm,
But I think balanced literacy, what I've shown in my reporting is that balanced literacy has sort of theoretical foundations that go back to some things that were good ideas at the time, but
right,
have been shown by all this research over the past 50 years not to be the case. So that's really, I would say, what I've been driven by in the work that I've been doing over the past few years is try to tease out kind of where ideas come. What are the ideas people have about how kids learn to read? Where do they come from? Are they right? Are they not right? They've been, I think, sort of misguiding a lot of people for a lot of time in classrooms. And I think you and others are now having this aha moment like, oh, huh,
right, right.
this stuff is profound.
It is. And, the way that you explained it made it really accessible to not just people in education, but, for every person. And I think, when we really want to have a big change, it really does need to have people from the front and the back and the middle kind of moving forward. It can't
Absolutely.
just be one person because, as you explained, there were so many people who were saying, but wait a minute, that doesn't, what you guys have been doing doesn't
Yeah.
work. And yet their voices didn't always receive an audience. So yeah,
And
I
a
know.
big shout out to all the teachers who were that way. Because, first of all, over the years, I've heard from many teachers who were like, I've been trying and trying and trying to say this for a long time. So there are those teachers. And then there's an even bigger bunch of teachers, I think, who had a gut level feeling something wasn't quite right. They had
Right,
plenty of kids that they couldn't reach. They knew something wasn't right, but they were working really hard. They were doing
yeah,
all the things they were told to do,
yes,
and it still wasn't working. And one of the really big moments for a lot of teachers was recognizing without meaning to, they sort of started blaming other factors. It wasn't about their instruction because they were doing everything right.
Working
So it
hard.
must be the kids. It must
Right.
be that they're not, I
Right.
mean, maybe even a little bit what it must be that they're not smart enough. It must be that their parents
Right.
didn't read to them enough. It must be that there are lots of other reasons that have to
Right.
do with their home and poverty that are getting in the way of them being able to read. And those things are real, as any teacher knows. There are a lot of factors in kids' lives
Right.
that make this challenging and mean they come to school not as ready to learn as a lot of other kids. And that's huge. That
Right.
impact is huge. But I think what all of the scientific research has shown, and what I've tried to show in my reporting, is that instruction really can make a difference and it should be making a difference. And
Yeah.
if instruction isn't making a difference, then there's something about the instruction that needs to change.
Right. I think I don't remember which episode it was, but you had mentioned something about a teacher had said that there was this underlying belief that there was a certain percentage of people that just were not going to be good readers. It's just they just weren't going to get the code. They weren't
Yeah.
going to figure that out.
Yeah.
And I would see that, and I think most people who are on here would also see that you would get your class list, and then it wouldn't be too long before you had your intervention group, and you
Mm.
always had 4 to 5 students in that intervention group, and 4 to 5 students who were approaching grade level, and then but it was always 8 out of 20 that
Yeah.
weren't where they needed to be,
Mm.
and I myself had this underlying belief that well these students just need more. What they needed is they needed different and more. They needed more.
Mm.
They need more of something different. Okay, that's
Mm.
grammatically incorrect, but you know what I'm saying, right? They
Yeah.
don't need more balanced literacy. They need more explicit instruction,
Yeah.
as well as everybody else's.
Yeah.
Even those who are achieving effortlessly.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
so
think one of the really big insights from all of this is that if the classroom instruction is more aligned with what we know about how people really learn to read, two things should happen. One, you can actually prevent reading difficulty in some kids, right? You can really
yeah,
prevent some of that happening. And a lot of it's really emotional right from the get go. Like it starts to be a thing that really creeps into a kid's self concept
super quick.
right away, right?
Yeah,
So you can both, so if instruction is more aligned, you number one can prevent some of the kids from having reading difficulties. Some of the kids still will have reading difficulties, right? Some kids are going to need way more than a classroom teacher with 20 or 25 kids is ever going to be able to do. They're going to need intervention. That's a real thing. But better core instruction should reveal those kids more clearly earlier. I know that what I'm doing is going to work for most of these kids. And then I can see really quickly, oh, there are these 3 or 4 and it's not working for them. So we really need to pull those kids out, give them more,
right.
maybe give them something a little bit different. And that I think is a really important takeaway from all of this. And I want to make sure that policymakers and others who are thinking about all of this are thinking about that just changing core and curriculum, just buying a new curriculum, we could talk about that too, is not going to do it.
Right.
This is really about teacher knowledge. Often they need a good curriculum to really, and there are really reasons to invest in a good curriculum, but this is really about teacher knowledge, and it's still going to be about some kids needing intervention. Like
Right. Right.
better classroom instruction does not solve the problem.
Does not solve everything.
Mm-mm.
And I think some of the things that I've been hearing from teachers that I work with is, asking them if their schools move to this approach to teaching reading a science of reading based or Orton Gillingham based instruction. And a lot of people say, yes, we have them. And then when you ask how many of you have been trained, and those hands go down.
Yes.
So it makes it makes change really hard when teachers are given something, but without really the why behind it. Because
Yes.
it's
Or the
really
how, the why and the how.
why and the how. It's easy to go back into things that we are accustomed to doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
okay.
That's one of my concerns going forward with all this stuff, because I think now there's a lot of attention to it. So people are thinking, oh, we're quote unquote doing the science of reading. And
Right,
if it doesn't have an effect in a few years, people are going to be like, oh, well, the science of reading didn't work. That's why I think it's really important for everyone, reporters and teachers and all kinds of people, to really be paying close attention to the implementation part of this, which is hard. And the truth is education is such a big complex system, and you could adopt, something can come from on high and you can be given new materials or whatever, but unless you're really given the why unless you're really given the how, unless you're really able to like work with your colleagues to really implement that well, not everyone's going to do it. Not everyone's going to do it as intended, and it's not going to have the desired effect, you know?
Like in the utopian world, like everybody would do it. And it'd be, I mean, I just think about how, our society could be so much better, right? I mean, not better, it would be better, but more cohesive, if we could have some of the issues that we have as a society that are caused by illiteracy, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, this is no panacea, no silver bullet, but I think one of the reasons that to go back to your first question,
yeah,
that I got interested in this in the first place and that I've stayed on it for as long as I have, is as someone who was covering education for a long time, what I started to realize is this is so core. This is so central. There are so many other things that we're trying to fix in education that
right,
wouldn't be completely prevented by really making sure all kids get off to a good start with reading instruction, but really could be, I think, substantially changed and mitigated. And there are things like engagement and behavior problems
right,
and dropping out of school. These are all things that you can see when you talk to people and when you look at the research about it, that many of these things go back to. They have a connection to a correlation, and in some cases, I think a causation relationship to struggling with reading early on.
yeah. I mean, it wouldn't take very many times for people to say, "Hey, Dee Dee, we're going to run a marathon," for me to all of a sudden come up with all these behaviors to get me out of running. Like
Me too. I'll join you.
I'd be like, you would have to chase me with a cattle prod to get me to, to get me to do that out of the gate. And but if you said, "Hey, let's ease into this," and today we're going to do this and we're going to do that. Yeah, we can see how students get very overwhelmed and then decide, "I'm getting out of here because this is not comfortable."
Totally. But to
Yeah,
take your metaphor a little further, you could also have a cattle prod telling you to run a marathon, and you and I still wouldn't be able to do it. I couldn't run 26 miles because I'm not trained. I haven't practiced.
exactly.
And so it's that too.
Right. Even if I
I
was
would
thinking
just
I
I
wouldn't do
would
it.
just get killed by a cattle.
If there's chocolate at the other end, I mean, I might be your girl. But other than that, don't want me on your relay team for sure. For sure. I was going to ask you, what do you think about the future from here? Like, what do you envision as the future for early childhood education? That's a huge question. So you can
Yes.
bits of that if you want to. But what do you kind of see?
I don't know. I mean, I'm feeling hopeful because of the teachers I hear from all the time. I think this is all the things that we just said. This is all very difficult. Education is a complex system. We're a big country.
Yeah,
Change in education is always hard. Change is always hard. Period.
right.
But I feel hopeful because so many teachers are like you, which is they started to discover something years into their career, and they'd been doing things one way and suddenly realized, and they're trying and they're doing it and they're asking really good questions. And so you know I feel hopeful because of that. And the other reason I feel hopeful is because this matters a lot to some people. Like, it doesn't matter a lot to everyone, but there are people in the system, parents and teachers in particular, for whom this is one of the most important things. And a
Right,
lot of times it's because of their child's struggle with this. And
right.
I think those people are going to kind of keep the pressure on the system to get better. I hope
I
so.
hope so too.
But I think the most important takeaway is it feels like this is the long haul. I mean, I think everyone has to be in this. Like, it's not going to change and get better in like 2 years. And I see superintendents making promises like 90% of the kids are going to be in grade level in 3 years. But right now, 45% of the kids are in grade level. And I think that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen. And we might want it to happen because we know it's important because there are kids right now. But people have to set realistic goals here. And in education, I think we don't do that all the time.
Right.
We're afraid to set realistic goals because somehow it might seem like you're giving up on some of the kids if you're saying, hey, well, for 45% now, maybe in 3 years we'll be 55%. But then you're still like, oh, wow, well, I've just admitted that we really should be able to get the vast majority of these kids, and I can't get them there right now. But I think it's better to do things well than to do them fast.
I think so too. And I think, in well, I guess in society, but in education also, there's a lot of bright and new shiny things that come up. And,
Yes.
that's driven by lots of different factors. It can be new research, of course, right? But sometimes it's um, somebody wanting to push a new idea that
Yeah.
may or may not necessarily. So, and I think as teachers, we love a lot of us like to be creative and we like to do things
Yes.
differently.
Yes.
And so we like to, we don't want to do the same lesson. Oh, but we know that's what they need. Would they need the same type of instruction
Yeah.
numerous times? I always make the analogy, like if I was going to plant a garden, and I always say this wrong, so I have to think about it. But if I was going to plant a garden and I got my hoe and I was going to hoe a row, right? Sometimes I say row a hoe, and that's a totally different conversation. But I say row a hoe, and then I want to put a seed in there. There's some students whose their earth is ready for that, so I don't
Yeah.
have to do a whole lot for that to make sense. But other students have ground that's really hard, and so I have to do it a lot, and it doesn't
Mm,
make sense for me to go here and here and here and here because I'm never going to have that ground prepared right, which was
mm,
sort of the balanced literacy approach of like we're just going to
mm.
put everything out and see what grows. Uh,
Right.
anyhow, so that's kind of,
Huh.
but if we, I'm sorry, apparently we have to shake our heads and sneeze at the same time. That's Ozzy and Harriet in the background. But
Aw.
we, myself, I have this teacher kind of ADD, kind of where I'm constantly going to a new thing.
Yeah.
Where we really need to just, like you said, it's a long game. We've got to
Yes.
stay the path and
Yep.
hoe that hoe that row. Row, I don't know. Anyhow, what I always mess that up. So have you really noticed, and I want to be value. I told you we were only going to talk for 15 and we're almost at a half an
That's
hour. So I'm going to be really,
fine. I told you I talk a lot.
I know. Are you seeing a change in teacher um, response? Like for myself, when I first heard that I was doing it wrong,
Ouch.
I
Yeah.
was like, well, that can't be right. And there was a lot of like, that can't be right. And then I looked and I was like, well, that sounds right. I mean, it sounds right. And then pretty soon I'm like, okay, so some of us get there quicker than others. Are you noticing, changes in teachers' perspectives?
Definitely. I mean, I've actually seen some teachers transform before my eyes, like on Twitter or X, teachers who were very um, defensive and pushing back and critical of me and my work years ago. And I've watched them change their minds publicly, which is very interesting. And I've followed up and, chatted with some of those people about that. So that's interesting. And I would say another tenor in the emails that I got a lot from teachers, and it hasn't gone away entirely for sure, but I feel like there's been a change in volume. I would get a lot of emails from teachers who were like, I am afraid. I am afraid to even bring this up. Like, I know there's something wrong. I have started to dig into this, but I have to like close my door or we have to whisper about this. They really feared like retribution kind of like they were really sending me emails that had a tenor of like um really afraid that they were going to be like punished for speaking up.
Right.
And that's really changing. And again, there are teachers who still write me that kind of email, but I get more emails that are like, hey, my colleagues and I are really talking about this amongst each other and we're going to the principal, or the principal is talking to us about it, or they're talking about it at our school board meeting. And that's great. So it feels like this conversation is getting so much broader and
Right.
so much more broader and more consistent. And that is allowing a lot of people to learn about this from each other. And I think one of the tenets of balanced literacy that was appealing to a lot of teachers, and that's a very important tenet, is that the sort of idea of balanced literacy is that the teacher knows best, right? You know your kids in your classroom the best. You can make the decisions about what they need. And one of the things, so I really listened to that, and one of the things I realized but it's a problem if a lot of teachers don't know what they need to know about how kids learn to read.
Right.
Yes, we want to be able to trust teachers, but it turns out that there's this big missing piece for a lot of them in terms of this knowledge. Now, as teachers start to know this, I think yes, actually, it really should be a lot about your knowledge and you're making the decisions for your kids. However, I think it's really important for us to recognize that there are good ways of doing this that people can learn. And what you talked about, teachers want to be creative. No one has to reinvent the wheel. And first of all, you could get a little of your time back on the weekends and have more life if you're not reinventing, if you're not making up everything on your own.
Right, right, that would be amazing.
And if we know that there are certain things that really help kids, then you should be doing those things. And it might be boring for you. Maybe you have to do those things over and over again, but
Right.
it's not boring for the kids. And
Yeah.
what's the goal here? The goal is that they read and, you know,
Well, and if you're strategic with your instruction, then you don't have to spend as much instructional time, on that particular subject. So you're not having to do hours and hours of phonemic awareness if you're very strategic and you're,
yeah.
precise
Yeah,
in your
yeah, yeah. I think
instruction.
hours and hours of phonemic awareness is not good for teachers or kids, I don't
No,
think.
nobody likes that.
No, that's not, that wouldn't be all of this research played out in the classroom in an accurate way.
Yes, yes. I was just going to leave everybody. Thanks everybody for being here. But one thing that you said, I sat in on your session there in Indiana, and I just loved it. Is that you said that we just want to remain curious,
Yes.
and
Yes.
I love that. And I'm going to cry again. I told you I wasn't going to,
Oh,
but I do think that I think the moment that we feel like we have all the answers, we're going to probably do somebody some disservice. So
yeah, I mean, I say that, I say stay humble and stay curious to everyone here for a few reasons. First of all, I think part of how we got in this mess is maybe trusting people too much, trusting people who are telling you this is the way without interrogating enough. What's it based on? Where's the research? What's the evidence? What's the theory that this is based on, right? So
right,
that's important. But I also think the stay curious, stay humble is, I think, figuring out how to really do this at scale, right? To really do this in a classroom for all the kids in your classroom. What are you going to be able to do to really reach most effectively and efficiently all of those kids and identify the kids who need help? And then how do you do it in an entire school, in an entire district, an entire state, and then this entire gigantic country? Like,
yeah,
we haven't actually done this successfully at scale. So everyone's got to be learning from each other here,
I love that.
because it's not like anyone really knows how to do this. A lot of people are learning here about how to translate this stuff into practice and do it at scale.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much.
You're
You have been so
welcome.
generous with your time, and it's just such an honor to have you part of our summit in the winter.
Yeah.
So thank you for saying yes. Thank you for agreeing to come on. And we have a bunch of people who have commented here, but I was so listening to what you were saying that I didn't even see it. So
Oh, sorry, everybody.
everybody wants to know, what does it look like in the classroom. So I think that's what we're continuing to work on. So
Absolutely. And that's where I hope to keep doing more reporting over the next few
yeah,
years. Now, a lot of
yeah,
stuff is changing, and we need to go out and see what's working and what's not and why. This is part of the stay humble, stay curious, keep asking questions. Everyone, I'm going to try to do that too.